Rebellion leaves us in a condition that we call depravity, total depravity. Every part of our character and every part of our existence is compromised in some way or another by the consequence of our alienation from our good Creator. As we see in these primordial narratives through Genesis 11, and as we also see in the book of Judges, where it says, "In those days in Israel there was no king, everyone did what was right in his or her own eyes." When we follow our instincts, chaos results, because we are resisting the governance of our true king. This is not only true on a personal scale, it's true on a cultural scale. Our cultural sensibilities structure evil and disorder on larger social scales. So it's not just my soul or my person that's fallen. My culture is fallen. My people are fallen. And this is true even on a cosmic scale, in what the New Testament likes to call the world. The world is the grand conspiracy against God's kingship. Genesis through chapter 11 show us mired in a problem of our own making that we are helpless to get out of. Rules are necessary in an arrangement like that, but as we later see with Israel's Torah, with the covenant of Moses, rules to restrain evil can't actually solve the problem of our unrighteousness. So self-expression just reproduces the problem, and as we've seen, rules create their own set of problems, especially when sin co-opts them and manipulates them. What about rights prescription? What about virtue? Will that save us? In our fallen condition, virtue's benefits are real, but they're severely limited in what they can actually deliver. They certainly can't deliver us. One big reason for virtue's limits is its scarcity. It has to be comprehensive. You have to have the whole list of virtues. And also, the raw material, as well as the finished material for virtue, seems to be in tragically short supply. Let's start with how virtue needs to be comprehensive. One weak link destroys a whole chain. One vice in an otherwise talented, admirable person can constitute a tragic flaw. And the classical tragedies usually root that tragic flaw in pride. And the pride spurs even from the character's own strengths, which become occasions to make too much of him or herself. And that one character flaw destroys the whole person. Virtue has to be comprehensive to lead to true human flourishing. If I have courage, if I have temperance, if I have wisdom, but I lack justice, I am a tyrant. I am a terror. This may be why in the stories we tell, in the films that we watch, sympathetic tragic heroes outnumber melodramatic Hollywood villains, as well as archetypical Hollywood heroes like Superman. These sympathetic tragic heroes are ambiguous, right? We like stories nowadays where some flaw in a character jeopardizes the whole happy ending because that one flaw might take down the character and take down the victory. Virtue also needs some raw material to work with, and people display unequal, inborn propensities, potential, which resists change. You can't just turn an average person into a genius. Now, some moral propensities are more widespread. It probably is easier to turn an average person into what we call in our culture a good person, someone who's a decent human being who has decent relationships with others. Still, Aristotle is not after a good average society. He's after human excellence. And there aren't many examples of human excellence because there isn't a lot of excellent human potential. Evolutionary biologist E.O. Wilson liked to use the metaphor of undeveloped film. He said, you can overdevelop or underdevelop a piece of exposed film, but you can't turn that picture into a picture of something else. I know many of you have never seen photographic film, but the metaphor still works in the digital age. Let's say I take an average picture, and in post-production, I want to make it great. Well, I can only make it so great depending on things like the original resolution, the original lighting. Human beings are like that. There's only so much you can do with us. And truly virtuous people like Chesley Sullenberger, the pilot that N.T. Wright mentions, are rare. He became the Grand Marshal of the Rose Parade in my hometown of Pasadena. There's only a few of those kinds of people in the world who become that kind of moral hero. Is natural scarcity the only reason for this and the need for virtue to be comprehensive? Or is sin playing a role as well? Well, Christians say, yeah, sin is playing a role. Paul, John, Later figures like Augustine and Martin Luther and so many others, all following the Psalms, root our failure not just in unrealized human potential, but also in something that's fundamentally wrong in the world and that needs to be set right in ways that we are just not equipped or maybe even aware enough to do. Sin and depravity have left us in a situation that calls for more than decent human beings. We need rescuers. We need something superhuman. So while cultivating virtue in a widespread, above average way is certainly going to make life better, in fact, a lot better, it isn't really going to solve our deepest ultimate problem. So what can be done? Well, the first 11 chapters of Genesis show the limits of what can be done, apart from what God starts doing in Genesis 12. The measures that God takes against evil in those first chapters show that the ultimate restraint against sin and depravity is the threat and the reality of death. As Genesis 3:19 says, "Dust you are, and to dust you will return." But that's not the only consequence of sin that God measures out in these chapters. God expels the man and the woman from the garden, and that displays a different wage of sin, a different consequence, that of dispossession, where we lose what we were given, and repossession, where God takes back what is God's. He protects the tree of life with an angel with a fiery, ever-turning sword. Dispossession and repossession is one of the consequences of sin. And there's a third way that God handles sin and depravity in these chapters, by dispersing us. God's words to Cain after Abel's murder make Cain a wanderer on the earth. Not only is the land alienated from him, he is alienated from others. So dispersal is a consequence of sin and depravity, which limits its cost. Likewise, when God confuses the tongues of human beings and the nations disperse to cover the earth, that consequence of dispersal, and really disposal, is a way that God treats the problem of depravity, by deconcentrating human power. If God's goals for creation were in green, exaltation and life and fruitfulness, these three consequences of sin that you already see in the primordial narratives represent the lack or the failure of those goals to be attained. Instead of exaltation, it's absence, shame and dispossession. Instead of life, the grave and death. Instead of fruitfulness and honor, disposal and dispersal. Take a look at this chart, starting on the left, where old creation was full of potential, colored in yellow, and where God blessed human beings by making us in His image, enjoying unique relationships with God, with one another, with all creation, with ourselves. Well, look at what these three consequences dispensed in these early chapters demonstrate about what sin and depravity do. They take us off the mark. Sin is missing the mark, right? They take us off the course that leads to exaltation and life and fruitfulness. We miss those three things. Instead of gaining the exaltation of sharing God's likeness, His own glory, as His imaged servants, we become dispossessed, and our stuff and sometimes ourselves become repossessed by the God who can no longer trust us with them. Instead of inheriting life from that tree of life, in fact, eternal and abundant life from the tree of life Himself, Jesus Christ, the second person of the Trinity, we return to the dust from which we were taken. We enter the grave. Sin brings death, the absence of life. We're made to be fruitful and to make the earth fruitful. Sin and depravity rob the earth of that fruitfulness because it strips us of our fruitfulness. And the consequence has to be that we are disposed of, or at the very least dispersed, deconcentrated, disempowered. You will see these three consequences develop into full-blown destinations for sinners. Harem and the lake of fire become the symbols of dispossession and repossession. The grave, Sheol in Hebrew, Hades in Greek, becomes the lair of the dead, where the dead go. And a place of disposal where useless things are put becomes Gehenna, Jerusalem's city dump, where trash is taken out to be incinerated. We tend to collapse those three images into hell, into one place, and then we're puzzled by how outer darkness and an incinerator and a place of punishment can all hang together. Well, they don't, do they? Because while these three good things do hang together, exaltation and life and fruitfulness all describe our Lord and Savior, the absence of them doesn't hang together. Those three goals, life and exaltation and fruitfulness, those all hang together in Jesus. Missing the mark doesn't mean we miss in the same direction. We sort of fall apart. Sin's trajectory is unraveling creation, undoing what God has done. So it makes sense that our various images for hell don't hang together. And it also makes sense that an ethic or a moral system can't put together the pieces of Humpty Dumpty again. They've fallen apart. Managing our sin and depravity is never going to do more than just keep us hobbling along. It's never going to get us to the goal that now is unreachable apart from God's action. God had a goal, that we transcend our beginnings and that we gain God's own likeness. And sin and depravity deprive God of that goal. After all, how can a fractured and unruly humanity image our one King, our one God, coherently? How should we cope with depravity? Aristotle has solutions, right? The Nicomachean Ethics is all about what to do in the situation we're in. But his solutions are largely workarounds around virtue's scarcity and its partiality. He recommends relationships that nurture virtue, and especially the true friendship that can happen among moral equals. Of course, that means that people with inadequate morals are befriending other people with inadequate morals. He recommends aristocracy to spread the benefits of still scarce virtue among people who can be well led. Those are great recommendations, and they do make things better, but they don't solve the problem. They just mitigate the problem. Classic American pragmatic solutions are also workarounds. Here in America, we tend to seek results through competition by means of market forces, economically, and politically separation of powers, which limits vice or even leverages vice. Private vice is public virtue, Adam Smith said. This is realistic, at least in the sense that it gets that after Babel, we are going to be competitors, whether we like it or not. We might as well find arrangements where the competition benefits us. But even where it succeeds, and it doesn't always succeed, sometimes our own success creates new problems. Vast wealth can create disparities in wealth, and the disparities can leave our elites out of touch from the lives of the rest. That's been happening for a while here in America. The situation kind of reminds me of when wealthy Egypt in the book of Exodus ended up enslaving and oppressing the Hebrews through whom they got rich in the first place because of Joseph's dream. Socialism pursues results as well, but it pursues them through collectivism, through regulation, through universal education, through egalitarianism. And these have had mixed results, sometimes quite ironic results, when instead of egalitarianism, you get a caste system with party insiders getting a lot of power, where regulations create inefficiencies and shortages and supply chain failures. But even where they succeed materially, they don't succeed spiritually because, again, they don't solve the underlying problem. They are a kind of Torah-like strategy of justification by law, which Paul says did not produce the righteousness that God wanted for God's people, let alone all the families of the earth. So these strategies to cope with depravity amount to fig leaves, like in Eden when the man and the woman hid from each other, or at best animal skins which God provided, which covered their need for the moment but didn't take care of their long-term need. At the individual level, people cope personally with depravity, their own depravity and other people's depravity, by relying on relationships, smaller scale ones, family, friends whom you can trust, voluntary associations of people who think somewhat alike, including churches and volunteer organizations. People also cope through relationships of group identity. We feel safer when we're with people like us. We feel more understood and better defended. At the individual level, people cope with depravity through moral training, school, athletics, the arts. People cope with depravity through diversion, by getting their minds off of the situation with entertainment, with substances, intoxicating substances, with work. Work is a great distraction to get your mind off of things, by escaping to nature. Of course, this is not solving a problem, it's just escaping from it. Blaise Pascal said that distraction was one of the great dangers of his era, and it's even more of a danger today, because it keeps our mind off of the fact that we have a problem that needs addressing, even if we don't have the resources to solve it ourselves. See, if a way out from depravity and its consequences has approached, if one has been supplied beyond our own resources, our own faculties, then being too distracted or too withdrawn or too committed to our coping systems to notice it, let alone embrace it, we're going to stay stuck. A few more personal coping strategies. There's detachment. Just put some emotional distance between me and my predicament, or even withdrawal from the structures that seem to be hurting us. And religious detachment and religious withdrawal can be a coping strategy too, and not a healthy one. Existential self-expression is another coping strategy. In the face of depravity, we can just make our mark. We can tell our story, maybe in a way that's depraved, maybe in a way that's resisting that depravity. Either way, the self-expression can be a coping strategy. Well, I mentioned earlier that Ecclesiastes follows Proverbs for a reason, and Ecclesiastes sees through all of this, all of it. All of it's pointless, all of it's vanity. So do Ecclesiastes-minded successors like Soren Kierkegaard. These coping strategies can make things better, sometimes generally and lastingly better, like the right economic and political system, sometimes just temporarily better, like substance abuse or a vacation or emotional detachment. But they won't lift us out of the grave. They don't remedy our true fruitlessness. Even the things that we produce aren't satisfying. They don't yield security or exaltation. Jesus said, don't put your treasure where it can go away, where a thief can steal it, or where rust or a moth can consume it. And they certainly don't lift us out of the grave. None of them gives us life that outlasts death.